Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story name: The Bone Collector's Forest. The air in the forest felt colder than it should have been for early spring, and the wind whispered through the branches with a voice that seemed too intentional, as if something or someone was listening, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Lily, her backpack slung over one shoulder, took a deep breath as she pushed through the thick underbrush. She had come here for a reason, one that she couldn't quite explain, though she had been feeling the pull for weeks now. The Bone Collector's Forest. The name alone was enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. It was the kind of place that parents warned their children about in hushed voices, the kind of place that tourists, even those daring enough to explore abandoned places, avoided. But Lily had always been drawn to the forbidden, the untold stories of places like this. And tonight, there was something about the forest that felt inevitable. The forest had always been a subject of local legend. Some said it was cursed, others said it was haunted. It wasn't unusual for people to go missing in the dense woods, but it was the stories of the bone fragments that piqued Lily's curiosity. The scattered bones of animals, yes, but it was the human remains that kept people from stepping foot here for years. The rumors of the bone collector, a man, or something else, who had been carving the forest's twisted trails, leaving pieces of bone along the way, scattered like breadcrumbs for those foolish enough to follow. Lily had heard it all, and she'd ignored it. Until the dreams started. The whispers in the night, the tug at her heart. They called her, whispered her name until she couldn't resist any longer. And so, here she was, at the edge of the forest, feeling both terrified and exhilarated by the unknown. The further she ventured, the darker the woods became. The trees, impossibly tall, stood like silent sentinels, their branches intertwined, blocking out much of the fading daylight. The sun was already dipping behind the horizon, leaving a heavy gloom to settle over everything. Each step she took, the floor of the forest seemed to grow softer, the earth underfoot damp and spongy, as though it had absorbed too many secrets over the years. Then she saw them. A few yards ahead, the path narrowed, the trees growing even more twisted and gnarled. And there, scattered across the trail, were the bones. Small ones at first, twigs that looked like cracked femurs, scattered ribcages half buried in the earth. And then, as Lily stepped closer, she noticed the skulls. They were human, their empty eye sockets staring up at her, wide and hollow, as though they had been waiting for someone to find them. Her stomach churned. She had heard about the bones, but seeing them was something else entirely. The skulls were too pristine, too carefully placed, as though someone, or something, had arranged them intentionally. The air felt oppressive now, suffocating almost. The whispers that had been so faint in the background of her mind grew louder. They were no longer whispers, they were voices. Faint but clear, as if they were trying to get her attention, warning her. Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced around, but the forest seemed empty, save for the bones at her feet. Yet she could feel it, the presence. Something was watching her. Something old, something patient. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to move past the skulls, pushing forward, though her heart thudded in her chest like a hammer. The path seemed to narrow further, the trees growing closer, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick, stifling, and with every step, the forest felt more alive, more aware of her presence. And then she saw it. At the end of the path, barely visible through the fog that had begun to roll in, was a clearing. A large, flat rock sat in the center, surrounded by more bones, bones of every shape and size, their pale whiteness stark against the dark earth. They weren't just scattered haphazardly like the others. They were arranged in a circle, a ritualistic pattern that made Lily's skin crawl. In the middle of the circle was a figure. At first, it looked like a person sitting cross-legged on the rock, their back to her. But as Lily stepped closer, the air seemed to freeze, and a wave of nausea hit her. The figure was too still, too perfect. Their clothing, black as night, blended with the surroundings, but it was their face, or lack thereof, that made her blood run cold. There was no face. Instead, a smooth, featureless mask of bone covered the figure's head, its eye sockets dark and empty, like those of the skulls she had seen earlier. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It didn't even acknowledge her presence. But Lily could feel the eyes on her. Or at least she thought she did. The voices were louder now, almost deafening, echoing through her mind like a chorus of the damned. "He's waiting for you." Lily wanted to turn and run, but her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure, from the mask that seemed to draw her in like a magnet. It was as if the very earth beneath her feet was rooted to the spot, as though the forest itself was holding her in place. Suddenly, the wind howled through the trees, the branches swaying violently as if some unseen force was stirring the woods to life. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something move, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast for her to make out. It was large, too large to be human, its movements jerky and erratic. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished, leaving Lily standing there, heart racing, a bead of sweat trickling down her neck despite the cold. A low, guttural growl filled the air, coming from the figure on the rock. It was so deep, so unsettling, that it reverberated in her chest. The mask on the figure's face began to crack, slowly at first, then faster, as though the bone was shattering under immense pressure. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice whispered, though the figure's lips did not move. Lily's breath caught in her throat. The forest had gone completely still. The air was thick, heavy, and then the bones began to move. They shifted, creaking, snapping in place like a twisted puzzle, forming shapes, figures, and grotesque, nightmarish images. The forest floor seemed to come alive with movement, as if the bones had a life of their own. In an instant, the bones began to crawl toward her, their movements unnaturally fast. The masks, those identical bone masks, started to appear, each one drifting out of the forest, floating in the air toward Lily. "He's coming," the voice said again, this time clearer, and it filled her ears like a low hum. Lily stumbled backward, finally able to move, her body screaming at her to run. But the forest wouldn't let her. And then she heard it, the faintest sound coming from behind her, from the shadowy depths of the forest. The sound of bones cracking. Lily turned, her breath catching in her throat, but before she could move, a sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped, staring down in shock to see bone fragments jutting out from her skin, as if the forest itself had decided to claim her. The story takes a terrifying turn here, with Lily now being part of the forest, marked by the bone collector's curse. The presence of the bones and the mysterious figure hint at something much darker waiting for her. The cliffhanger leaves readers on the edge of their seats, wondering if she will escape or succumb to the fate that the forest seems to have in store for her. The pain that shot through Lily's chest was unlike anything she had ever felt. It was as though the bones of the forest itself had reached out, pierced her, and were now anchoring her to the cursed ground. Her hands went instinctively to her chest, trying to pull the splinters of bone out, but they only dug deeper, as though they were a part of her now, an extension of the forest itself. The forest was claiming her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with the stench of decay that clung to everything around her. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears, each pulse reminding her of her vulnerability, of how close she was to being swallowed whole by this malevolent place. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch and writhe, almost like living things, wrapping themselves around her, suffocating her in their grasp. They whispered, those voices again, louder this time, sharper, filled with hunger. You're marked now, you can never leave. Lily's knees buckled, the strength drained from her legs as she collapsed to the forest floor. Her hands scraped against the cold, wet earth as she tried to push herself up, but her body felt heavy, weighed down by the bone fragments lodged in her chest. They were spreading. She could feel them, inching deeper into her flesh, pulling her into the earth, binding her to the very forest that had been feeding off the lost souls for centuries. The voices, once distant and fleeting, were now a constant barrage inside her mind, their words impossible to ignore, overwhelming her senses. He's coming for you. She could feel it, the presence of something ancient and powerful moving through the trees, its gaze fixed on her with a predatory hunger. The forest seemed to exhale, a deep, guttural sound that made the ground tremble beneath her. The air grew colder still, as though the life in the forest was being drained away, sucked into something terrible and unseen. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of bones clicking together. It was so close now, so real. It was as though the bones were moving on their own, drawing nearer, their rattling growing louder with each passing second. The trees around her groaned, as if they were alive and aware of her, their twisted branches stretching downward, their gnarled fingers reaching for her, ready to pull her deeper into their nightmarish grasp. Lily's body trembled, and panic surged within her. She needed to get away. The clearing, the figure on the rock, the bones, it all felt like a trap now, one that she couldn't escape from. The air was thick with dread, heavy with an oppressive weight that crushed her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Her eyes flicked toward the figure on the rock. The mask, the hollow eyes, everything about it was wrong. The mask began to crack further, its jagged edges splitting open as though it were a living thing, its movements jerky and unnatural. The figure's hands, once still, twitched, its long fingers curling and uncurling as if testing the air, searching for something. Lily tried to crawl backward, her fingers digging into the earth, but the forest seemed to stretch and close in around her. The trees whispered, their voices a low, murmuring chant that made her blood run cold. She could no longer tell where the whispers ended and the wind began. They were one and the same, filling her ears with the promise of something terrible coming. He's almost here. The voice was clearer now, louder than before, and it was coming from the direction of the figure on the rock. It was as if the very air around her had become alive, saturated with the presence of the bone collector, and with each passing moment he was drawing closer, his steps silent but inevitable. And then it happened. The figure on the rock moved. The sudden motion was so fast, so jarring, that Lily's breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't just stand, it rose. Slowly, almost deliberately, its skeletal hands stretched out before it, as if testing the air. The mask cracked wider, and a deep, hollow voice rumbled from within, echoing in Lily's mind. "You've come seeking answers, but now you belong to the forest." The voice was low, like a growl, the words carrying the weight of centuries. Lily could feel the ground beneath her shift, the bones, those ancient fragments, tightening their grip on her. It was as if the earth itself had turned against her, pulling her into its cold, unyielding embrace. And then she saw it. From the corner of her eye, another shadow moved, a tall, dark figure emerging from between the trees. This one was different. Its movements were smooth, deliberate, as if it was gliding through the underbrush. The creature's face was hidden in shadow, but Lily could see its glowing eyes, two orbs of light that burned with an unnatural fire. It was as though the very darkness of the forest had given birth to this thing, and now it was coming for her. Her heart hammered in her chest. Her body screamed in terror, but her legs wouldn't obey her command to flee. Her body was frozen, her mind trapped in the nightmare unfolding before her. The figure on the rock stepped down from its perch, its movements unnaturally fluid, like the branches of the trees themselves had animated its body. It was so tall, so impossibly long, that it seemed to stretch out of the very fabric of the forest. And its mask, those hollow, empty eyes, were fixed directly on her, as though it could see into her very soul. "You can't escape," the voice said again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many, a chorus of whispers, of cries, all layered together, all carrying the same message. "You're one of us now." The voice was clearer now, louder than before, and it was coming from the direction of the figure on the rock. It was as if the very air around her had become alive, saturated with the presence of the bone collector, and with each passing moment he was drawing closer, his steps silent but inevitable. And then it happened. The figure on the rock moved. The sudden motion was so fast, so jarring, that Lily's breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't just stand, it rose. Slowly, almost deliberately, its skeletal hands stretched out before it, as if testing the air. The mask cracked wider, and a deep, hollow voice rumbled from within, echoing in Lily's mind. "You've come seeking answers, but now you belong to the forest." The voice was low, like a growl, the words carrying the weight of centuries. Lily could feel the ground beneath her shift, the bones, those ancient fragments, tightening their grip on her. It was as if the earth itself had turned against her, pulling her into its cold, unyielding embrace. And then she saw it. From the corner of her eye, another shadow moved, a tall, dark figure emerging from between the trees. This one was different. Its movements were smooth, deliberate, as if it was gliding through the underbrush. The creature's face was hidden in shadow, but Lily could see its glowing eyes, two orbs of light that burned with an unnatural fire. It was as though the very darkness of the forest had given birth to this thing, and now it was coming for her. Her heart hammered in her chest. Her body screamed in terror, but her legs wouldn't obey her command to flee. Her body was frozen, her mind trapped in the nightmare unfolding before her. The figure on the rock stepped down from its perch, its movements unnaturally fluid, like the branches of the trees themselves had animated its body. It was so tall, so impossibly long, that it seemed to stretch out of the very fabric of the forest. And its mask, those hollow, empty eyes, were fixed directly on her, as though it could see into her very soul. "You can't escape," the voice said again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many, a chorus of whispers, of cries, all layered together, all carrying the same message. "You're one of us now." Lily could feel her skin growing cold, her muscles locking in place as though she were being drawn into the very earth beneath her. The bones, those terrible, cursed bones, continued to move, shifting and crawling toward her, wrapping themselves around her, consuming her. The shadowy figure that had been gliding through the forest now loomed over her, its eyes burning with an intensity that made her head swim. She could hear its footsteps now, the soft crunch of the forest floor beneath its feet, its presence looming, closing in. And then, just as it reached out toward her, the ground beneath her cracked open, a jagged, gaping maw opening wide, pulling her into the darkness below. "It's too late," the voice whispered, and Lily's world went black.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.